Sticking with infrastructure developments, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana announced the allocation of an additional 46.7 billion rand to key infrastructure projects. This boosting spending by national, provincial and local government to 1 trillion rand over the next 3 years. The investment is said to be key to boosting economic growth in South Africa, and Pragma has called for infrastructure investment to be viewed holistically across the entire asset's life cycle. Earlier, I caught up with Pragma's business lead, Stephan Kornelius, for greater insight on how far the infrastructure allocation can go in growing the economy.
We look at infrastructure investment as purely an enabler, right? So it creates the backbone that we need to create jobs and create products and be able to grow our economy. And so it's vital, right? So it's definitely something that we find encouraging in the budget, that it wasn't cut.
Yes.
But certainly just one of the elements. And so we're encouraged that it's there, but we think there's certainly some things that are important things that can be done to make sure that we get the best bang for our buck out of the spend.
Now, talking about things that need to be done so that we get the proper return on investment, of course, infrastructure needs to be maintained. Is government investing in that?
We don't think it's being done enough. You know, at Pragma, we talk about responsible asset ownership. And if you look at the state of the local government and national government infrastructure around you, I think it's clear to everybody that that's not a priority for government at the moment. And as a result, a lot of that money, even though it's there, is being, we're not getting a long-term return on it because the assets are not staying in production for that long.
Yeah.
Now, hospitals, roads, water, energy, all the things that are being prioritized in the current budget need a lot of attention and maintenance over their life cycle to remain in good condition and to be able to provide the service that they're there for.
We'll talk about that maintenance planning. When it comes to that, where and when does that begin in the asset's life cycle?
It actually starts right during project planning. The current budget talks about creating policy and frameworks for planning and funding of these projects.
Yeah.
But what we refer to as operational readiness actually starts during the funding and planning process of these projects, where your capability to operate and maintain the asset and to provide things like the proper spare parts to make sure that these assets remain working are all part of the planning cycle. And we don't see that as being a priority in the current budget discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, because of this, then, is government finding itself more times than not getting that proper return on investment on infrastructure projects?
Absolutely. There's just been a story in the news, for example, around City Power and how their maintenance budget has been misallocated. And it's those types of things that create this low return on investment. And it's public funds that we're talking about. So it's in your and my interest to make sure it gets done properly. If you think about your car, for example, if you don't do anything to the car and if it's brand new, it will run fine. And then all of a sudden, you'll be in massive amounts of trouble and you have to spend a fortune to keep it on the road. And that's where we find public infrastructure in this country at the moment. Eskom was another good example. The power stations were left to fall into such a level of disrepair that it cost a fortune and a lot of time to get them back up into working condition. And at Pragma, we think we can do a lot the country can do a lot to make sure that we prevent that in this current spending cycle.
I mean, for this infrastructure investment to be a useful catalyst for economic growth, what needs to support it from a regulatory point of view?
I think there's two elements to that regulation. The one is in the actual funding cycle, where the funding body, and that can be either state-owned enterprises or government itself, needs to be clear about what the priorities or the prerequisites needs to be for funding to be allocated to this project in terms of operating and maintenance capability. So that's the one element of regulation.
Yeah.
And I think the second one is about the operating environment. You know, South Africa is known as a country that has a lot of red tape in terms of attracting investment and making it easy for businesses to operate. And as I said earlier, these assets create the backbone, but they don't actually generate the economic activity. The actual companies that use them or the public entities that use them are the ones that actually generate economic activity. And so, there's a wide range of economic and investment regulations that need to be made easier for us to access and to operate, so that that actual job creation and economic activity can be sustained over the longer life cycle of the assets.
Well, in terms of attracting investment, there's also the introduction of new debt instruments in infrastructure investment. How important can that be?
Look, I think it's a very important element to create transparency in terms of where the money goes. The minister has talked about introducing new bonds for infrastructure funding, for example, and those are publicly traded instruments. They get traded on global capital markets. And so I think it's important to diversify the investment base and attract foreign and local private investment into our infrastructure spending. But again, that's going to require certain certainty to those investors to say, we'll give you the money, but we need you to own and operate these assets in a responsible way before we'll actually take that risk.
All right. Well, we do have to wrap up the conversation there, but thank you so much for those insights as we embark on a journey to economic growth, and particularly using infrastructure as an enabler. That was Stephan Kornelius, business lead for Pragma Professional Services.